great pleasure to welcome to our 2024 Online Trend Summit, the Food People's Head of Insight, Shokofeh Hejazi, to talk about how we see these overarching themes, but specifically within culinary and the gastronomic landscape. So thanks, Shokofeh, for joining us again today, and welcome to our virtual stage once again.
Hi, Charles. So excited to be here again today.
Bro, so if you're participating in today's summit as a Trend Hub subscriber, you can immerse into all of the detail of what we're going to be talking about over the next sort of 50 minutes or so. In this presentation, in the 25-26 cuisines and ingredients predictions pack and all of the supporting prezos and videos and that kind of stuff on Trend Hub. Shokofeh, in a second, I'm going to hand over to you to share with us what this future horizon looks like, specifically through our cuisines and ingredients and gastronomic lens. And if it's okay with you, I'll dive in with a few questions if that's all right as we go through.
Of course, would love that.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much again for that intro, Charles, and so great to be with everybody here today. As Charles has mentioned, I have the very exciting job of talking to you all today about the wonderful world of cuisines. So, for those of you who are subscribers to our service, when you log into our online portal, Trend Hub, to check out our annual framework, which I hope lots of you will do after today, you'll see that there's actually a whole dedicated section on the hub where we deep dive into cuisine trends. Now, the cuisines framework in and of itself is a treasure trove. We spend thousands of hours each year gathering data on how cuisines are evolving around the world. We track dozens of global cuisines, honing in on their market appeal and their trend-setting influence to create maps that not only show how they're evolving year on year, but also how they all sit as against each other. This is a veritable trove of information, as you can imagine. Now, as well as the maps and charts, what the cuisine framework also gets, because of course we love a wheel at TFP, is its own trends wheel. And that trends wheel has its own center core that explains not just what's happening in the world of cuisines, but crucially, why. Now, last year, as some of you might remember, our center core in our cuisines framework was around the world. Now, this was our driver because really we found that diners were looking for eating occasions as a source of joy and distraction. Essentially, they wanted what they ate to transport them to their happy place. And for a lot of people, that meant faraway places around the world, hence the name of the center core. So the question, of course, is what is this year's center core and how did we get to it? Well, first things first, there's no denying that we are, of course, living through tumultuous times. So food is still a really important source of joy and distraction. Now, last year's gastronomic driver was all about food transporting us to happy places. And of course, that's still super relevant. And diners are still really excited about global exploration. In fact, many of the cuisines that we pulled out in last year's framework, like Italian, Japanese, and Korean, are still super relevant today. And we dive into those and more in detail in our Eat Happy megatrend in the food and beverage framework. But of course, although some cuisine trends like those, Italian, Korean, Japanese, are still relevant this year, the culinary landscape has also massively changed in lots of ways and evolved. So the question is, how has that change shifted and what does the culinary landscape look like this year? Well, the key to this discussion is that really it's a story of evolution. Where cuisines are concerned, at the start of this decade, we kicked off what we at TFP call the era of conscious cuisine. In a nutshell, it's all about being in an era where cooks come from different places and backgrounds, and they're exchanging ideas and techniques, and they don't feel encumbered by strict definitions when it comes to their approach to cooking. Now, in the years that ensued, this led cooks to really question that status quo, challenging traditional notion of how flavors are used in the first place and how they can be combined. Now, 2 years ago, we flagged how this really led us to joy as a key driver in cuisines, because in throwing the rule book out the window, cooks could really let their creative juices flow and bring us dishes that put a really much needed smile on our face. And last year, this naturally evolved into that center core of around the world because people looked for that joy in global exploration. They wanted food that would transport them to like a beach or a bistro. So the question is, what now? Well, as I've mentioned, people are really looking for food to still distract them from their troubles, maybe even transport them to far-flung places around the world. But what's also true is that with every year that passes, we're increasingly knowledgeable about global cuisines, which means that cooks really have to push the envelope to delve deeper into things like regionality and authenticity. But delving deeper doesn't mean that there isn't plenty of room for creativity and change and joy still. After all, we're seeing plenty of third culture and new wave cuisines push through as well this year. So all of that comes together to really tell us that this year's Center Core is still something of a story in global exploration, as food does need to transport us from our troubles and put a smile on our face. But this year, it's a story of two halves, old school and new wave. Essentially, what this means is that diners still want food that displaces and just distracts them from their day-to-day worries. And for some, that might mean leaning into go-to cuisines like British, Thai, Chinese, or Indian, but they want to delve deeper into these. Meanwhile, for others, it's about looking to new it cuisines like Latin, Caribbean, or Filipino and exploring these sort of new wave ways of cooking, as well as things like fusion and reimagined classics. And it's really through this lens that we're going to look at cuisines for the purposes of today's session. In the first half, we'll focus on what cooks are doing with what we call those forever favorites, the go-to cuisines, the ones that are already a firm fixture of our food diaries. And then in the second half, we're going to look at the other side of the coin, that new school, what the new wave cuisines have to offer us. And I think the best thing for it is really just to dive in with the first of our forever favorites, which is one very close to home. It's UK and Ireland. That is right. This is really exciting because we're finally getting our dues on the global gastronomic stage as cooks and diners alike from all over the world are getting excited about the food traditions of the regions of the UK and Ireland. From Wales, for instance, we're seeing people get excited about things like lamb caul, Welsh rarebit, Glamorgan sausage, Caerphilly cheese, and Barabrith, which is that delicious fruitcake, perfect with a cup of tea. Then from Scotland, we've got everyone's favorite haggis, but also things like bridie, meat pasties, cockaliki, which is chicken and leek soup, Cullen skink, which is a totally comforting haddock and potato soup. Also things like tatty scones or potato pancakes, and cranachan, which is a dessert with fruit, cream, and oats. And of course, we can't forget about the delicacies of Northern Ireland and Ireland. Things like soda bread, potato farls, Irish stew, box tea, which are sort of potato dumplings, colcannon, which is mashed potatoes with cabbage or kale mixed in, or my personal favorite, spice bags, which are a bit of a cult favorite that typically consists of salt and chili chips, chicken, pepper, and onions all tossed together, like you can see in the image on this slide, perfect for both preventing and curing a hangover. And of course, we can't forget about English grub. Now, chefs are really reviving a lot of old school and lesser known dishes, things like smoked English eel, peas pudding, Lancashire hot pot, Stargazy pie, and Brummie bacon cakes. And there's also plenty of pub classics enjoying a renaissance, things like ham, egg, and chips, ploughmans, bangers and mash. Now, for these, what we're seeing is cooks really take a back to basics approach with ingredient led cooking, things that call out the provenance of the best British ingredients, with dishes like beef and Guinness pie with clotted cream mash, or a black pudding Scotch egg with Oxford sauce. In fact, if you're wondering about how best to embody this approach, a good port of call, as ever, is the ethos of St. John, who've really made their name for decades with this ingredient-led best of British approach, where they create dishes like the one pictured on the top of this slide, a gorgeous ham infused in hay braising juices, which then comes under a lovely shield, a melted ogle shield, which is a British raclette style cheese. Now, as if all of that didn't sound comforting enough, you must save room for pudding if we're talking about British and Irish classics. And again, here it really is about those classics. Those old school retro favorites like whiskey cake, Battenberg, spotted dick, treacle tart, rice pudding, or I especially love Scottish fern cake, which is the example on this side, Scotland's answer to a Bakewell tart, here made with Scottish strawberries, of course. And if we're talking about all things British and British food culture and Irish food culture, that's actually a great segue onto the next trend that I wanted to pull out for today's session, because it's all about a cuisine which we've adopted as our own. And that is, of course, Indian. Now, as a nation, we have a seemingly bottomless appetite for Indian food, and this really presents an amazing opportunity for cooks to delve deeper. In fact, we've got to remember that we've barely scraped the surface of what Indian cuisine has to offer here. One thing we're seeing a lot of at the moment is cooks really bringing to the fore just how diverse India's food culture actually is, as its different regions really offer totally different flavors and specialties for people to tuck into. That means it's high time that dishes like Kashmiri gushtaba, which are meatballs in a sort of creamy spiced yogurt, Kolkata kati rolls, which are flatbread wraps, or Goan prawn balchao, which is kind of a spicy prawn pickle, to become as commonplace as something like a korma or a sagaloo or a naan. Now, also coming to the fore are chaat, which are little bites that are often served as appetizers, drinking food, or snacks. Things like vada pav, which I think a lot of people will have tried, those potato dumplings and buns, but also things like dabeli, which are spiced potato and pav buns also, but here they get layered up with chutneys, peanut and pomegranate. Also, papdi chaat, which are crisp wafers that are topped with potato, chickpea, raita, chaat masala, all totally more stuff. And my personal favorite, which are pani puri, which are those puffed, crunchy little spheres that you may have tried that get filled with sort of customizable bits like potato, onion, chickpea, chutney, and of course, the all important dash of that sort of zingy, spicy water that will be made with things like tamarind, mint, and chili, sort of comforting and refreshing and exciting all at the same time. Now, as well as those, what we're also seeing is cooks really championing Indian desserts more as well. Things like faluda, which is a sort of frozen treat made with rice, vermicelli, and ice cream, but also rasmalai, which traditionally are cheese balls that get soaked in in a saffron and cardamom scented sweetened milk. Now, these are delicious, served straight up. Totally recommend that you try them if you haven't before. But the elements also really lend themselves well to sort of fusion twists, things like rasmalai donuts. And actually, speaking about fusion twists, some of the most exciting movement in Indian cuisine really comes in that fusion with other cuisines. We already talked a little bit last year about something we've seen coming through, which is Indian Italian, things like Desi pizzas and sag paneer arancini. But also think about things like Indo-Chinese. There is a lot of dishes like gobi Manchurian, which is batter coated cauliflower that gets coated in a hot and sour sauce that are totally crowd pleasing. But also Indian Mexican. We're seeing things like lamb barbacoa tacos come through. And of course, if we're talking about those sorts of tacos and mashups and fast casual, there's plenty of twists with American cuisine as well. Things like butter chicken burgers, chaat hot dogs, and Carolyn fried chicken. You see, what's happening in Indian is really all about pushing the boundaries in a cuisine that people feel like they already know and love. So it's all about that delving deeper that we've been talking about. And actually, that's a lovely way to lead on to the next cuisine because it's another one that people really feel like they know and love already. It's another forever favorite in Chinese cuisine. Now, most of us have a go-to local spot that we lean into for a Chinese takeaway or meal out. And if you open the door to any food or foodie pantry like yours or mine, Charles, chances are you're going to find things like sesame oil, chili crisp, XO sauce, mala spice, Szechuan chili, hot mustard, all that good stuff. But as consumers do grow more knowledgeable, they're better understanding that there is no such thing as a singular Chinese cuisine. In fact, China has a vast, exciting, diverse culinary landscape. Whereas traditional takeaway favorites have tended to lean towards Cantonese and Sichuan, and like I said, we probably all have our go-to favorites in that sphere. Now we're seeing people delve deeper into the culinary traditions of places like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Fujian, and Hunan. Now, dishes synonymous with Hong Kong, for instance, will include things like curry fish balls, egg tarts, pineapple buns, and cart noodles, which are sort of brilliant customizable soup noodles that you add toppings to taste on. And actually, speaking about soup noodles, comforting bowls of noodles, rice, and soup are another really big draw of this cuisine. From DIY dumpling soups to breakfast congee. Congee is a sort of savory rice porridge for anybody who hasn't tried it. But then there's also at the other end of the spectrum more elaborate takes like crossing the bridge noodles, which is actually a Yunnan specialty where a bowl of soup is served under a sort of layer of fat that keeps the soup inside it warm. And it all comes tableside with sort of an array of rice noodles, raw vegetables, and meat that can then it sort of combine to taste, to order. And yeah, just sort of add that interactive element to what is already a really comforting setup. Now, all of that being said, it's not just about traditional fare and regional specialties driving the popularity of Chinese cuisine worldwide. What we're also seeing is a new wave of cooks really creating a genre of what they sometimes call mod Chinese cooking, where they meld local flavors with modern techniques and twists. And of course, that means a little bit of fusion. We're talking about things like jerk chicken fried rice, prawn toast tacos, crepes that get filled with Szechuan bechamel and spring onion instead of cheese and ham, or having a little fun with combinations like Peking duck bao that get topped with a little dollop of caviar at the end. It's about keeping things really thrilling and exciting, but really at its core, most importantly, delicious. And actually, Chinese is not the only Asian cuisine that's being sort of dissected and reimagined in these exciting new ways, thinking about, how we can push those delicious envelopes. Because next up, we also have another forever favorite in Thai. Now, Thai is actually one of my personal favorites because it does so seamlessly blend big, bold flavors in what are actually quite crowd-pleasing dishes. And the fact that things like massaman curry and green curry and pad thai are so crowd pleasing is exactly why it's high time for us all to delve a little deeper into this cuisine. Cooks are really going bigger and bolder with staple ingredients in Thai, things like fish sauce, tamarind, shrimp paste, Thai basil, kaffir lime, and lemongrass. And what that means is that the dishes like massaman and pad thai can kind of move over a bit because it's time to make way for other iconic dishes that have cult status in Thailand and lean on some of those ingredients and are ready to make their mark globally as well. Things like pad krapao, which is holy basil stir fry, also kai ju, which are those fluffy fried omelets you may have had in Thailand, and also northern Thai khao soi, which is a curry and coconut noodle soup. And actually, talking about khao soi, cooks are delving deeper into regional and city-specific Thai cuisine in general, which again is full of so many amazing, diverse local specialties. That means they're, not calling a menu Thai per se, but they might specifically hone in on Northern Thai barbecue or serve up rather than chicken, Southern Hat Yai style Thai chicken, which is actually pictured on the slide here, that would get typically served up with crispy shallots, sticky rice, and dipping sauce. Look out also for a bit of Thai Chinese fusion coming through, which is really inspired by Bangkok's vibrant Yaowarat district or Chinatown, where people will very typically eat things like khao mu deng, which is red pork rice, guai jub, I hope I pronounced that right, peppery rice noodle soup with crispy pork, offal, and herbs, and also popular drinking foods like kanong gui chai, which are garlic chive dumplings, perfect with beer. And actually, speaking about fusion, it's not all about Thai Chinese. Thai cuisine is really being effectively fused with American, British, Italian, and other cuisines too. That means we're seeing things like Thai tea milkshakes, Chiang Mai sausage rolls, spicy lob burgers, Thai chicken tenders with kaffir lime aioli, all that kind of good stuff that just makes your mouth water at the thought of it. Now, speaking about mouth watering, last but not least, Mexican. Now, I could not talk about what's happening in forever favorite cuisines around the world without giving a shout out to Mexican cuisine. And this is really because we've talked a lot in recent years about how authentic regional Mexican is really going from strength to strength. And this stands very true today. We can see it in the popularity of dishes like elote corn, tamales, aguachile, and mole, which we see more and more of in the mainstream. And this exploration of regional, authentic Mexican food really does go from strength to strength. And we're seeing even more of a shift in this sort of sphere towards real, regional, everyday food, the types of things that you'd actually eat in a fonda in Mexico, which are typically sort of family-run, homey establishments that serve really simple, unpretentious, delicious food. And really, what is more unpretentious than tortillas and tacos? I included the examples on this slide to really bring to life just how versatile Mexican cuisine and these mediums in particular are. Now, at the top, we have homemade totopos or fried corn chips that are being served here with a pumpkin seed mole at a trendy new London restaurant that is quite fittingly called Fonda. And underneath that is a dish that I personally love. It's a play on tostilocos, which are a popular Mexican street food, where a bag of tortilla chips will get split open and then loaded to taste with toppings like chamoy, fresh veggies, peanuts, mayo, whatever you fancy. And I really love the example on this slide because it shows how you can have lots of different ways of looking at this. Here, they've actually topped it with a lovely fresh ceviche. Again, just looks like the kind of thing that you'd love to swig back with a cold beer. And underneath that, I also really wanted to include this example because it's from another super buzzy restaurant, this time in New York, where they actually serve nachos two ways, tall and flat. And the flat ones are pictured here, where they dress each individual chip with refried pinto beans, cheese, beef, and pickled jalapeno. Now, what this is a really great example of is another trend that we're really seeing come through in this space, and that is, believe it or not, nouveau Tex-Mex. But the key here is that this really isn't the Tex-Mex of our childhood where it was just about cheese and more cheese. This is proper gourmet takes on dishes like chili con carne, huevos rancheros, or breakfast burritos. Essentially taking those formats that are super comforting that we know and love, maybe from our childhood, but giving them that all-important ingredient-led foodie makeover. I'm conscious that I've talked a lot about this, and we're about to move on to the second half of the session where we look at that sort of new wave cuisine. But I've heard a lot of my own voice, Charles. Does any of this sort of trigger any thoughts or
Yeah,
questions that you wanted to put at
absolutely.
me?
I was wondering when you were going to draw breath so that I could dive into questions that I've got, and I'd like almost to go back to the beginning of the presentation, really. And I found it super exciting and quite refreshing that we're talking about British and Irish food. I was a couple of weeks ago over at Food on the Edge and seeing how the audience was getting so engaged with Irish cooking and not only the dishes but the producers, the incredible oysters and seafood and that kind of stuff. And I suppose my question is, why do you think British and Irish food is finally getting that time to shine? Why is now the the moment, I suppose?
It's a really good question. I think there's a couple of answers to it. I think one of the reasons that we're sort of getting our time in the spotlight finally, is actually to do with a wider trend that we're seeing in the food world. It's something that I know you've talked about already today in your session, which is JOMO, that sort of that joy of missing out, that home being the sanctum, leaning into cozy nights in with loved ones, where you have things like a Sunday roast or a fry up, with all the trimmings, baked beans, sausage, all of that good stuff. British, Irish cuisine, it just lends itself so well to this ethos, to this way of living, of sort of tucking up, and saying home is best. I want to stay in and I want to tuck into comfort foods with the people I love around me. That's definitely one of the reasons I think it's having a moment. I think the other reason is also, again, it's a reflection of the times. As I said, the reality is we are living through tumultuous times. There's a bit of a cost of living crisis going on. What is really great about a lot of British and Irish staples is that they are versatile and relatively cheap and cheerful and lean into humble ingredients like potatoes, bread. If you look at things like roasties, jack potatoes, pasties, sausage rolls, even a Sunday roast, relatively speaking, these can be things that can be done on a budget, but twisted up and added to and made your own, and taken to sort of new gourmet heights. I think that's another reason that it's really having a moment.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's super. That's really interesting context. And I think the other cuisines that you've talked about, although we've talked about them quite rightly under the heading of kind of those sort of old school kind of favorites, there seems to be this theme running through all of the cuisines that you've talked about so far around um, them being accessible and cheerful and cheap and almost like street style, but that going gourmet across those different cuisines. I mean, you've talked about things like spice bag and chips and burritos and sandwiches. Is that is that the correct assumption to read into what you've been saying? Is that what we're saying?
100%. Again, I think it's a little bit about a reflection of the times we're living in. It makes perfect sense. If you look back to '08, and post-financial crisis, that really was the spawning of the street food revolution and the gourmet burgers. And that's kind of what we're seeing now here. We're seeing lots of chefs, maybe not even feeling like they need bricks and mortar, but turning into street food and fast casual to really show their skill and ability, because there's no reason that, like we say, a burger, a burrito, a hot dog can't be done with the same Michelin level quality that you would a fine dining meal, but on a bit of a better budget. I think the other thing that it's really reflective of is a sort of democratization of eating in general. People do want that Michelin worthy food. They want to know that great cooks have taken an ingredient led approach and are serving up utterly delicious things, but they maybe don't care about having tablecloths. They
Mm.
want to be sure that they get bang for their buck. They want guaranteed deliciousness, essentially. And that is, again, quite reflective in fine dining trends that we're seeing across the board, where we see really high-end restaurants serving up, mini sandwiches, mini hot dogs, mini pasties, even fried chicken tenders as part of tasting menus, which is super exciting.
Yeah, and I refer back to one of the presenters at Food on the Edge. I was listening to Ashley Palmer Watts talking about was what he's doing at the Devonshire in Soho, and it is exactly that. The sourcing of those ingredients, the care in the butchery and the cookery and the technique,
Absolutely.
but in essence, steak and chips.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, really good example of that. And I suppose my other question is around Mexican, and I suppose slightly controversially, we've talked a lot about authentic Mexican. I mean, you've talked about it today, but also in previous iterations of the cuisines and ingredients framework. Um, this whole trend around Nouveau Tex-Mex, it feels like it could be at odds with that. What do you think about that?
I can see why you'd say that. But actually, the two things can very much be true at the same time. Like I said, and we stand by it. Authentic, regional, local Mexican really does go from strength to strength. You can see it in how much better versed people are becoming in the differences between, the cuisine of Oaxaca versus Mexico City, for instance, or knowing their way around different types of mole, different preparations of tacos, and all that kind of stuff. That does go from strength to strength. We still see lots of openings showing that shining through. What can also be true is that, that drive to authenticity, to realness, to deliciousness can also work for Tex-Mex. If we take the example that I've got up on the slide, or that we finished on, that trendy place in New York where they're serving
Mm.
Tex-Mex specials like tall and flat nachos. I mean, that's a place that's opened by a chef who actually grew up on the Texas-Mexico border
Mm.
and grew up really eating this kind of food, drawing on culinary influences that are around them. We also see it with a lot of, third culture chefs coming through, where it is true and authentic that they grew up eating different cuisines and drawing on influences from different places. And it's not inauthentic to take the things that they grew up eating and give them that makeover and show it to us in a new light. And actually, that is something that I really want to delve into in more detail, and does segue us quite nicely into the second half of the deck
Perfect.
that I wanted to share for
That's it.
today. Right, so on to the second half. We've looked at the first side of the coin in our Center Core for this year, which was all about sort of old school rules, forever favorites, go-to cuisines, how we're delving deeper into regionality and authenticity for those forever favorites. But now it really is time to look at the other half of our cuisine story, which is the new wave. Essentially, these are the new cuisines and waves of cooking, which are really biting at the heels of our traditional go-tos. And again, I think the best thing for it is to just jump straight in, because we did segue so nicely with that conversation around Tex-Mex onto this. First up, we've got no rules. Now, anybody who has tuned into our trend event sessions in the last few years will know that we have been talking for a little while about the fact that fusion is no longer a dirty word. That's why something like Tex-Mex can really shine again right now. Today's culinary landscape really is being defined by cooks who just don't feel like they have to rigidly define their cuisine or style of cooking. In fact, a lot more cooks are identifying as third culture kids, which means that they've grown up in a culture outside of their parents' country of origin. And what it also means is that they can authentically draw on multiple cuisine influences without compromising on taste or deliciousness or authenticity. Now, what's super exciting is that this really adds fuel to that fire of no rules, multi cuisine cooking, which is playful and creative, but really importantly, not gimmicky because it's being carried out by cooks who understand the cultures and flavors that they're drawing from, like the chef who grows up eating both American and Mexican food and can fuse them together beautifully. Now, what that means is that as long as you do keep deliciousness and respect at the core, you can go big when it comes to fusion and think beyond typical go-tos. We do know about Tex-Mex, but why not think about Pakistani Mexican or Cuban Chinese? The world really is your oyster here. You can feel free to mix influences from Asia, Europe, Africa, or the Americans, or even put them all together in a single dish. Maybe employing a format like taco or pizza as a sort of gateway and a canvas for creativity. Essentially, what we're saying is feel free to throw the rule book out the window and try, introducing people to lesser known ingredients. Cook with snails if that takes your fancy. Blur the lines between meal times and occasions. So if you want to have breakfast for dinner or make a cacio e pepe inspired cocktail like the one we've got on this slide here, just go for it, basically. Challenge the status quo about what constitutes, dinner or breakfast or street food versus fine dining. Because what we're saying is that with the right tools and skill and cuisine play, things like chicken tenders and hot dogs can really be elevated to all new gourmet heights. And actually, that mention of hot dogs is a key one because it's such a big trend this year that I really did want to pull hot dogs out in their own right. They are giving burgers a run for their money, coming in hot, if you will. We're seeing chefs essentially really let loose with hot dogs as a canvas for creativity. Now, one thing we're seeing is a lot of premiumization. I love the example at the top of this slide that kind of brings that approach to life. We see cooks doing things like replacing a traditional frank for a sort of Wagyu beef, adding elements like truffle or bone marrow gravy, things that you basically wouldn't be remiss to wash back with a glass of champagne. And what I also really love, at another end of the spectrum, is an influx of global hot dogs that we're seeing come through. Things like, not everybody realizes that Latin America loves hot dogs almost as much as Americans do, and they have lots of their own versions. So we see people who hadn't before having a go at swapping out their traditional hot dog for something like an Argentine choripan, which is a chorizo roll, a Chilean completo, or a Sonoran hot dog, which is actually the example that I've included on this slide. Essentially, it's a take on a hot dog where you wrap a beef frank and bacon and then top it with jalapeno salsa, mayonnaise, tomatoes, and pinto beans. And yeah, just looks totally, totally Moorish. And what that is actually just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to having fun with fillings and toppings and the bread itself. What we're also seeing is people challenging the notion of what a hot dog even is, doing things like making sushi dogs or pizza dogs or octopus dogs, where a tentacle makes up the sort of frank element in the middle of the bun. And if we're going to talk about mashups, I've got to give a shout out to cuisine mashups as well, which is where arguably cooks are having the most fun with hot dogs. They're combining flavors from one, two, three, even four cuisines on a single handheld hot dog. And that throws up dishes like Tex-Mex hot dogs that get topped with cheese and crunchy nachos and then get served with a sort of Chinese hot pot dipping sauce on the side. But also things like Thai some tum dogs that might have, instead of relish or coleslaw, green papaya and chili peanuts as toppings. And actually, that is a lovely way for me to dive into the next of our trends if we're talking about Asian flavors and influences. And this is really one of my favorites, because what we're seeing come through is a new wave of Pan-Asian pushing into the mainstream. A bit like with Tex-Mex, this is something that means we're sort of redefining previous notions about fusion cooking. In this case, it really is no wonder because we're seeing so many East and Southeast Asian cuisines trending. We all obviously know how big Japanese and Korean has gotten in recent years. We talked last year about Southeast Asian cuisines really pushing through. Obviously, we've already talked about Thai, but there's also Malaysian, Filipino, Indonesian, Vietnamese. All of these are really vying to be it cuisines on the global stage. What they also are really unique, diverse cuisines that have amazing pantries and larders full of really versatile ingredients that stand up on their own, but also like lend themselves really well to cuisine and flavor pairings. So what we see are sweet ingredients like pandan, ube, coconut, matcha, kaya, Thai milk tea. And then on the savory side, things like fish sauce, lemongrass, sambal, exo, gochujang, miso, being paired up and fused in really amazing ways, with cooks really pushing the boundaries when it comes to flavor in terms of the sort of melding and differences between profiles like sour, salt, bitter, umami. We see lots of what we've talked about again recently, a lot of swavery, where you combine sweet and savory elements all together. It's really, really flavor forward cooking that really pushes your sort of belief in what Pan-Asian can be because it draws on influences from across the board, but without compromising on that all-important taste and authenticity. I think the examples on this side bring that to life really well. We've got on the top a green curry ice cream sundae that gets finished with banana, peanuts, and fish sauce caramel. Like I said, really going double down on those big, bold flavors, but doing it in a way that seems like super accessible and exciting, but uncompromising in terms of authenticity. Ditto underneath that, we have a salt and pepper fried pork chop that gets served over crispy gold rice, then finished with a Taiwanese beef noodle gravy and served with Szechuan pickles on the side. I mean, if you look at that, talk about uncompromising, flavor-forward cooking that still looks totally authentic. And one thing that I did also want to shout out is those examples obviously are examples of elements from across Asia being fused in single dishes, but that's not the only way that Pan-Asian is trending. What we're also seeing a lot of is what we call sort of single menu, multi-cuisine approach to cooking. That means essentially on one menu, you could have things like sushi, prawn toast, dim sum, and laksa, and that's okay. But the key is that each of those things needs to be best of versions of those dishes. And what I really love about that and that approach to cooking is that it just embodies and shows how chefs are feeling free to serve up menus like this and to really put joy and deliciousness really like center of the plate, top of the agenda. It's about food that puts a smile on your face, really. And, if we're talking about food that puts a smile on your face, another really exciting trend that's coming through that we're seeing in terms of cuisines is Caribbean. And I love this one because I think Caribbean cuisine has really been long overdue its time in the foodie spotlight. So the question is, why is it trending now in general? Well, like I just said, we're looking for food that puts a smile on our face and puts joy and deliciousness center of the plate. And for a lot of people, it's really hard to imagine a happier place, a place that puts a smile on your face more than a Caribbean beach. And since airfare is sadly out of the question for a lot of us at the moment, what we do is look to places like Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Bahamas to really give us those Caribbean vibes, even if it's only for a half hour at dinner time. What we see are lots of staple dishes from across the Caribbean coming through then, things like curry goat, braised oxtail, Cubano sandwiches, rice and peas. But, it also means that we've started looking to the lesser known specialties in regional fare, things like pepper pot, which is a Guyanese beef stew, conch fritters, callaloo, which are leafy greens, and also Puerto Rican mofongo, which is one of my favorites, essentially fried green plantains that get mashed together with garlic and pork crackling. And I have to tell you, it's just one of the most Moorish things you'll ever eat. And of course, if we're talking about Moorish things from the Caribbean, I've got to talk about jerk chicken. Jerk chicken obviously is one of the emblematic dishes from the Caribbean. And it's so important that jerking, as people call it, is not just something you do to chicken. It is a way of life, a form of art in the Caribbean. And it's used to create dishes way beyond just jerk chicken. That sort of heady blend of jerk spice, which is typically made of Scotch bonnets, allspice, cloves, cinnamon, and lots of other good stuff, will get used to amp up anything from a burger to fried chicken. But it's not all about jerk, because biting at its heels to be the it dish from the Caribbean is also the patty. Now, classic Jamaican patties are probably the ones that people know best. Those sort of handheld pasty-like things that are turmeric hued, often filled with beef. But actually, what people don't realize is there's actually lots of varieties of patties across the Caribbean that twist up texture, filling. And what we also see is that, like their counterpart, pasties, they're super versatile for fusion cooking in the Caribbean and beyond as well. And we're seeing lots of gourmet, fun takes on the traditional patty. I've pulled a couple of examples on this slide just to bring it to life. At the top, there is there's a pie essentially where puffed patty pastry is encasing Wagyu beef and plantain chutney for a really gorgeous refined take on the classic. But then at the other end of the spectrum, underneath that, we have the viral mac patty from a place in New York that is said to have sold about $1 million of these in their first year. It's a patty that gets split open, filled with mac and cheese, put in a bun, and then topped with oxtail gravy for the ultimate sort of rib sticker, if you will. What that is a great example of is that sort of new wave third culture cooking that we've been talking about. And in the Caribbean space, that is something that is really taking the cuisine to new heights and introducing it to a new generation of fans as people try their hand at things like jerk chicken tacos, curry goat poutine, oxtail chow mein. Again, anything kind of goes. Um, Believe it or not, that does take us to nearly the end. I have one more trend that I wanted to pull out for you, though, before we do stop this whirlwind cuisines tour, and that is Latin American. Now, I did want to finish with this one because, like Caribbean, this is another super exciting, long overdue cuisine trend that we're seeing getting its time in the sun. We all know that on the global scene, we've already talked about it. Mexican is an absolute leader. It's a go-to cuisine. That's why we covered it off in our Forever Favorites discussion. But what's really great now that we're seeing is that with Mexican being a firm fixture of people's sort of foodie lexicon, now they're turning their attention to the rest of Latin America. And that means the cuisines of places like Peru, Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. Now, dishes that we see really leading the way here at the moment include things like ceviche. Lots of people will have tried it. Obviously, the raw fish dish where it gets cured in a spicy citrus marinade. Look out for one of the staple ingredients of that dish that often gets used, leche de tigre or tiger's milk, which is a blend of lime juice, raw fish, red onion, garlic, ginger, and coriander. But also look out for twists on it and sort of same but different versions like tiradito, which is a really lovely example of Nikkei or Japanese Peruvian fare, which people sometimes confuse with ceviche, but it is different. It's sort of a ceviche meets sashimi because the fish gets sliced thinly, served raw, and then finished with a citrus sauce over the top rather than the fish being cured in a citrus marinade. There's also lots of exciting things for meat lovers out there in Latin America. From Peru, we've got things like roast chicken with ají verde, which is sort of punchy, spicy green sauce. Also anticuchos, which are meat skewers, Brazilian churrascarias we all know and love. Same with Argentinian parrilla steaks that would obviously be served as a side of chimichurri. There's also the lots of street food and sandwiches that are worth exploring. We talked about choripan, those chorizo rolls, but there's also pupusas or arepas, which are sort of grilled flatbreads that can be, popped open and filled or fried or topped. Easy to think of them as a sort of Latin equivalent of a pizza. And obviously we all know how versatile pizza bread is. I also really love Colombian patacones, which are fried green plantains, Brazilian coxinas, which are shredded chicken that get like sort of encased in dough and then deep fried. And of course, empanadas. Who doesn't love an empanada? And last but not least, of course, we need to like satisfy the sweet tooth. And again, this is somewhere that we see Latin cuisine really shining. People are thinking beyond the traditional favorites like churros, and looking at stuff like tres leches cakes, mil hojas, which are kind of the Latin equivalent of milfoy, alfajores, which are Brazilian, sorry, not Brazilian, Argentinian. I think they are shortbread sandwich cookies that get filled with dulce de leche. Again, lovely with a cup of tea. But also, one to really look out for is acai. It's sort of having a bit of a renaissance globally. What's really great about it, like the example that you can see on this side, it's that smoothie blend of acai berries that can be customized to taste with things like banana, granola, peanut butter, but also really importantly, eaten any time of day. And I know that's a trend that we're seeing across the board around, lines being blurred around eating occasions, things that you could have for breakfast, dessert, snack, whatever, really. And yeah, that on that note, I'm conscious that I have talked again for quite a while. So I want to give you a chance to jump in with some questions, Charles, if you've got any.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. I'm sure, like everyone watching, my mouth is now absolutely watering. But there are a couple of key areas that really stood out for me. Um, and that was this notion about sort of one menu, multi-cuisine. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how big and bold can you go without it feeling, too contrived? Can you take this sort of Pan-Asian approach and take it global? Have a starter and a main and a dessert. They're all from different places, and I suppose I can see how you could perhaps do that in a hospitality or an out-of-home setting. But can home cooks have a go at this as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, if we talk about people really wanting to put joy and comfort, front and center, what is more comforting than having exactly what you like? And if that means having sort of an Asian starter, an American main, and then something else altogether for dessert, why not if it brings you joy? One great case in point in my own life, last week had a very busy day at work. They're all busy these days, but a particularly busy day. And I did one of my favorite things to do on a day like that, which is go to the supermarket and lean into the ready meal aisle. And as I was walking down, I thought, you know what? I kind of fancy a bit of everything. And so I went for a bit of everything. I got myself samosas as a bit of a starter. And then I lent into the Thai curries. I got a red curry and pad Thai for mains. And then at the end, I had a tiramisu for dessert. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's one of the best meals I've had in weeks, if anything, because I had every bit of everything that I wanted and was totally sated at the end of it. It's not inauthentic. It's reflective of how people want to eat.
Well, and I guess that segues really quite nicely onto another thought that I'd had, which is in a world where there's no rules, is there a rule of thumb for cooks and chefs if they want to dive into this sort of new wave fusion, third culture cooking? And whilst there may not be any rules, are there any kind of like frames or principles, I suppose, around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, obviously a starting point has to be sort of respect and authenticity. You don't want to delve into things where you're appropriating or being gimmicky. That is a starting point rule of thumb that we should kind of abide by. Don't just stick beef and cheese and wonton and call it a cheeseburger dumpling if you don't really know why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Now, saying that, I actually think it's important not to overemphasize that, because what is equally as important is pushing the envelope and experimenting and letting those creative juices flow that we've been talking about. Everybody talks about wanting to discover the next cronut. Well, that's not going to happen unless you put yourself out there and you experiment with formats and flavors. And what's really great at the moment is that we know we've got a receptive audience to it. If you look at what's happened in how mainstream swavery has become in the last couple of years, or swalty, swicy, swumami, whatever you want to call it, the sort of blurring of lines
Yeah.
between flavor profiles, that's something that we would have thought was crazy a decade ago. And now suddenly you see anybody throwing chili crisp or olive oil on their vanilla ice cream, or not batting an eyelid if miso caramel is served over their sundae, that kind of stuff. If you remember that, you sort of remember that creativity is the only way to push things forward. It's the only way to be that person who discovers that next big thing. Necessity is the mother of invention. Food as a necessity right now, we need joy. And therefore it's the time to throw the rule book out the window and see what it brings back to us.
Now, I guess cuisine is a continually evolving thing, isn't it? They're not, it's not something that is static. And your example about the chef, living on the Mexican border, and if your inspiration, your point of reference comes from that sort of third culture reference point, then that is authentic to to that individual and that story. And so cuisines that naturally evolve from those places, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And no one wants things to stay exactly the same forever.
Mm.
How we eat is evolving, and so therefore how we cook evolves, and that's the natural order of things. That's the way it should be.
Just one last question, and I completely get why you selected the cuisines and actually some of the kind of food genres that we have today. But um, what about some of the other cuisines that we've talked about historically? Like there was a big play last year around Italian and the other cuisines like Japanese that we talked about as well. Are they still trending? Where are they at? And I guess why haven't we talked about them today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Japanese and Italian in particular are such big players on the scene that they've almost gone so mainstream that the most fun stuff that's happening in it is in that fusion space. We
Mm.
talk about it a lot, as I mentioned at the start, in the Eat Happy megatrend of the food and beverage framework.
Yeah.
There are a lot of really exciting things about, introducing people to new things there, fusing it with elements of other cuisines. Italian in particular offers up a lot of gateway formats, things like pasta, pizza, are the perfect sort of creative canvas for this new wave of chefs who are, leaning into third culture and fusion cooking to introduce diners to ingredients and flavors that they otherwise wouldn't know. We see a lot of pizzas topped with sambal, curry, anything goes at the moment, and Italian cuisine is a really great one for that. There are so many exciting things happening in cuisines, to be quite honest, that we just couldn't fit them all in for the purposes of today's session. But rest assured, we do delve into them a lot in the full framework and in the cuisines framework.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. And honestly, thank you so much for this session. I'm sure, like everyone else, full of and brimming with inspiration, but also feeling rather hungry as well. And I honestly hope for everyone listening today, that's really brought to life for you how all of those combinations of factors, our growing knowledge about global cuisines, how that comes together with evolving food culture and traditions, but also how we can bring reimagined classics, third cultures we've talked about, fusion twists, and of course, creativity and joy in this space of old school, new wave. Shokofeh, thank you once again. Pleasure to welcome you to our Trend Summit, and thank you for giving us that insight into old school new wave. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. I can't wait to watch the rest of today's sessions.